Okay, so here's where we left off with chapter 23. We left off at rheumatic fever. It would have been nice to have this one in the last video because if I can get it to come up, guess who? Streptococcus pyogenes again. So this is yet another disease caused by strep pyogenes, and this one is actually kind of an interesting one. So this is when the bacteria causes the immune system to overreact to the infection. So this overreaction causes severe inflammation of the heart, but because it is partially the immune system overreacting, it's kind of an autoimmune component. So basically, the immune system sees the strep pyogenes and just basically freaks out. And it's just like, oh my gosh, here's this bacteria and it's scary and we don't know what to do, so we're just going to kind of freak out. And that autoimmune kind of immune system overreaction is what leads to inflammation of the heart. Um, so, this is actually very serious. It's just not something you hear a lot about in the United States, but this is a leading cause of death in children in developing countries. Again, there's a lot of parts of the world they don't have, doctors and hospitals and antibiotics to deal with strep. So, the kids get, a strep infection, just like lots of children do, and their bodies aren't able to fight it off correctly. And this is one thing that can happen is they get strep and their immune systems freak out. They can't go, there is no doctor, there is no hospital, and they can actually die from this due to heart failure, due to the inflammation of the heart. Sometimes this occurs in the United States due to serotype alteration. So that's essentially the same thing as antigenic variation, which we've talked about before. Essentially, it's a different strain of the bacteria. It's not a new species. It's just kind of like, it changes its membrane proteins just enough to where the immune system, overreacts to it, and it leads to this disease. Next is a disease called tularemia. It's a gram-negative disease. The organism is called Francisella tularensis. This is an infection of the lymph nodes. Interestingly enough, this disease is known as rabbit fever because it's transmitted by rabbits and squirrels. And it is a zoonotic disease, so it's a disease that we share with rabbits and squirrels. They can get sick from it, we can get sick from it, we can give it to each other. But yeah, so tularemia is also known as rabbit fever. It can also lead to pneumonia. There is worry about using it in biological warfare. So for whatever reason, it's just I don't want to say a good bacteria for terrorism, but it's just one that it holds up well. It can make a lot of people sick. It is gram negative, so gram negative bacilli are always kind of dangerous. And then it does take tetracycline to treat it. And tetracycline is a pretty strong antibiotic, so definitely it's probably not a disease you've ever heard of because it's not terribly common. It's more of a disease out in the Midwest. If you look in your book on page 642, there's a little map of the cases of tularemia. But potential danger. So. Other bacterial diseases of the cardiovascular system, brucellosis. Brucellosis is a bacteria that gets into the blood and the lymph, and it's transmitted by farm animals. So veterinarians, farmers, and other people that work on farms are at the greatest risk of getting this disease. And, we could call it, once again, flu-like symptoms, so fevers, chills, muscle pain, fatigue, but also swollen lymph nodes. So, this is one that almost is exclusive to, people that work around farm animals. You pretty much don't get it any other way. Anthrax, we've talked before. Anthrax is also spread through farm animals. So again, veterinarians and farmers are at the greatest risk. Anthrax, we know, is gram-positive, endospore former, Bacillus anthracis. It also produces exotoxins. It is resistant to phagocytosis. And what I want you to do is I want you to read in your book. I know it's so terrible having to read in your book, but this is one example of those times that I want you to read in your book. And what I want you to do is, starting on page 644 and ending on 646, and it's not even 2 full pages, it's probably kind of 1 full page altogether. I want you to read about the 3 different types of anthrax. I guarantee you I will ask you about the 3 different types of anthrax on the test. So you have cutaneous, you have gastrointestinal, and you have pulmonary. So what I want you to do is I want you to read in the book about the 3 different types of anthrax. I'll ask you questions on the test like, what's the most dangerous type? What's the most common type? What's the rarest type? So on and so forth. Okay, so just make sure you read in your book. Again, it's 644 to 645. There's only a little tiny bit on 646. But yeah, just read those few paragraphs about the 3 different types of anthrax. I do want you to refer to the book for that, and it will be on the test for sure. And then finally, we have gangrene, or also known as gas gangrene. This is when an infected wound has an interruption in blood supply, which causes tissue death. So we call tissue death necrosis. And then the progression of the necrosis is what leads to gangrene. Most people have heard of gangrene. They know it's really, gross and disgusting. The skin, the muscle tissue, everything kind of rots, and it's pretty gross. The bacteria that usually causes this form of gangrene is called Clostridium perfringens. But there are, certainly other pathogens that can lead to gangrene. And then also something like type 2 diabetes, because of the way it interferes with the blood vessels and with the nerves, that can also lead to gangrene as well. So we're talking, the most common type, that's going to be the Clostridium perfringens. And usually what has to happen is the person has to get that part of their body amputated so that the infection does not continue to spread over more of the body. Okay, so now we're going to talk about animal bites and scratches. So of course, our domestic pets, dogs and cats, very common for bites and scratches to occur anytime that they're upset or they're not, feeling well or whatever. Because there are more dogs than cats in the country, dog bites are much more common than cat bites are, but cat bites are much more serious. It's very important that anytime that you're bitten by a cat, that you clean out the wound really, really well with, lots of soap and water. It's, very common for cat bites to get infected. They have lots of bad bacteria in their mouths, a lot more bacteria than we have in our mouths. And there is such a thing as cat scratch disease or cat scratch fever. There's also something called rat bite fever. If you want to know more about these, they're in your book on page 647. So if you don't get this taken care of, it can lead to sepsis because of the very dangerous bacteria that these animals can carry in their mouths, and then of course they lick their paws, so then it gets on their claws, and then they scratch you with it and all that kind of stuff. But the only thing you need to know for the test is this. So in most cases of animal bites or animal scratches, penicillin is still the go-to treatment. So luckily, the bacteria that these animals carry, for the most part, do tend to still be susceptible to penicillin. And this is the question I'll ask on the test. So I'll say something along the lines of, what is the most common treatment for, cat bites or animal bites or something like that? And you just have to remember penicillin. I won't ask you about the different types of bacteria and all that. But if you're interested, you can certainly, check it out in your book. And your book talks more about the actual bacteria and, some of the statistics and all that kind of stuff, if you're interested in that. Okay, so quite a few very important vector transmitted blood diseases. So the first one we're going to talk about is actually plague. I know that, nowadays, well, I guess I shouldn't say this because then it's going to date the video, but as I'm making this video, I'm making the video from home because we're all pretty much quarantined from the coronavirus outbreak. So we kind of sort of know what it was like hundreds of years ago when people were locking themselves in their homes because of the plague. I kind of feel that way sometimes, at least. So anyway, it is a bacterial disease. The bacteria is called Yersinia pestis, and the vector is the flea. So you have to remember that hundreds and hundreds of years ago, there were rats pretty much everywhere. People had rats in their homes. There were rats, running the streets everywhere. And it wasn't, back in that time, they didn't really realize that diseases could be carried in that way. We're still talking about when they believed that diseases were caused by, the devil and witches and God punishing people for being bad. So they just did not recognize the fact that having all these rats around was causing some terrible diseases, and this is one example. So what would happen is, the fleas would get on the rats and the dogs and the cats, and then the fleas would, go from the animals to the people, and that's how the plague got spread. There are different types of the plague. So the Black Plague from the Middle Ages that wiped out like half the population. That was also called the bubonic plague. Again, you can read more about it in the book. You can there's probably whole entire books dedicated to talking about the Black Plague and what was all going on at the time. Like I said, reading about it in your book, go for it. You just need to know, the cause of the disease, which is the bacteria Yersinia pestis. The vector is the flea, so the flea is what spreads it. The flea will jump off the rat and onto the human, and that's what, can give them the plague. It's still sort of kind of around nowadays, but not, of course, not like it was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But this is why we have major rodent control now in most developed parts of the world. You go into a hotel or a restaurant, and if there's a rat or a mouse, they're getting shut down for sure. This disease is one of the major reasons why we have rodent control in this country is we do not want another bubonic plague on our hands. So one of the major ways of keeping the bacteria away is by keeping the rats and mice away. And then certainly also flea control. You don't want your house to be overrun by fleas because of your dogs and cats, because fleas carry other diseases too besides the plague. So not the most fun thing to talk about, but certainly a disease that has a lot of impact on human civilization. So I'm just about out of time. We're going to stop there because the next disease that we have to talk about is certainly one that, it's going to take a little bit of time. So we shall return.